She spent her last $10 on a forgotten ranger station. Her dog knew something inside wasn't right. The county clerk warned her no one had touched that place in decades, but Elaine signed anyway, with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. By sunset, she stood in front of a crooked cabin deep in the forest, silent, waiting. Inside, the air felt wrong, and her German shepherd didn't explore. He went straight to one spot and wouldn't leave. What would you have done? Walk away, or stay and find out what your dog was trying to show you? The county office was quieter than it should have been. Mid-morning, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a wall clock ticking loud enough to notice. Elaine Carter stood at the counter, her hands resting on the worn laminate edge, fingers slightly curled as if she needed something to hold onto. The woman behind the desk had stepped away for a moment, leaving Elaine alone with a stack of papers and the soft rustle of a building that had seen too many years and too few visitors. Outside, through the wide front window, a gray sedan sat parked along the curb. The paint had dulled from sun and weather. One of the rear windows was cracked open just enough. Bruno sat beside it. He wasn't pacing, wasn't whining, just sitting still. His ears angled forward, eyes fixed on the glass door like he was waiting for a signal no one else could hear. Elaine glanced at him once, then looked back down at the counter. Her money was laid out in front of her in small, uneven stacks, quarters and nickels in a loose pile, a few folded bills, 20s that had softened at the edges, a 10, 2 5s. She flattened one of the bills with the side of her hand, smoothing it without thinking. It didn't look like much. It wasn't, but it was everything she had left that wasn't already promised to someone else. The clerk returned, carrying a thin manila folder. She was younger than Elaine expected, mid-30s maybe, hair tied back in a loose knot, reading glasses perched low on her nose. She paused when she saw the money spread out. "You can take your time," she said, though her voice carried a hesitation that wasn't about patience. Elaine gave a small nod, not quite a smile. "I'm all right," she said. Her voice came out steady, but it sounded distant, like it had traveled a long way to get there. She picked up the bills one by one, counting under her breath, not loud enough to hear clearly, just enough to keep track. The clerk opened the folder and slid a single sheet forward. "This is the parcel deed," she said. "Bitterroot National Forest in holding. Old Ranger Station. Lot numbers on the top right." Elaine leaned in slightly, reading the typed lines. The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust. Official, but forgotten. Like something filed away years ago and only now brought back into the light. The clerk didn't move the paper yet. "There's something you should understand," she added, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document. "This property's been on record for a long time. No one's taken it. Not since the county assumed it." Elaine didn't look up. "I saw that." "It's not just the condition," the clerk went on. "Access is limited, seasonal, no maintained road after a certain point. And the structure itself," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "It hasn't been inspected in decades." A faint hum from the lights filled the silence between them. Elaine shifted one of the coins into place. "How long has it been sitting?" she asked. The clerk exhaled softly. "Longer than I've worked here. Records say early 70s, maybe before. It was decommissioned. After that..." She gave a small shrug. "People just stopped going." Elaine nodded once. That made sense. Places like that didn't need an explanation. They just emptied out. The last of the bills went into the pile. Elaine pushed the money forward across the counter. It made a soft, uneven sound as it slid. The clerk looked at it, then back at Elaine. "You're aware," she said, slower now. "There are no guarantees with this. No utilities. No services. It's remote." Elaine finally lifted her eyes. "I know." There was no edge in her voice. No defiance, just a quiet acknowledgement. The clerk studied her for a second longer, as if trying to place her somewhere, figure out what kind of person would stand here and make a decision like this. Then she nodded. "All right." She pulled the document closer, flipped it once and pointed to the bottom. "Sign here." Elaine reached for the pen. It felt heavier than it should have. Her hand hovered for a moment above the line, not shaking, not uncertain, just paused. Through the glass, Bruno shifted slightly, his weight moving from one paw to the other. His head tilted a fraction, as if something had changed in the air. Elaine lowered the pen. The tip touched the paper, and she signed her name. Elaine Carter. The ink settled into the fibers, dark and final. The clerk took the document, scanned it quickly, then stamped it with a firm press. The sound echoed lightly in the quiet room. "That's it," she said. "It's yours." She hesitated, then added, softer, "For what it's worth. I hope it works out." Elaine gave another small nod. She didn't ask for a receipt, didn't ask any more questions. The clerk gathered the money, counted it once more, and slipped it into a drawer beneath the counter. The folder was closed, then reopened just enough to pull out a copy of the deed, which she handed over. Elaine took it carefully, folding it once, then again, and slipping it into the inside pocket of her coat. For a moment, she just stood there. Nothing to do next. No instructions, no plan, just the quiet weight of a decision that had already been made. She turned toward the door. The bell above it gave a soft chime as she pushed it open. Cold air slipped in around her, carrying the faint smell of pine from somewhere beyond the town. The sky was pale, stretched thin with early clouds. Bruno was already on his feet. His tail didn't wag. He didn't jump or bark. He just stepped closer as she approached, his eyes searching her face, steady and direct. Elaine reached down, her fingers brushing along the side of his neck, resting there for a second. "Well," she said quietly. The word hung in the air between them. No excitement, no fear, just a beginning that didn't feel like one. She opened the car door. Bruno climbed in without being told, settling into the passenger seat like he'd done 100 times before. Elaine walked around to the driver's side and paused, her hand on the door handle. Behind her, the county office stood silent again, the windows reflecting a version of the street that looked almost untouched. Ahead, the road stretched out toward the edge of town. And somewhere far beyond that, a place no one had wanted, a place no one had kept. She got in the car, closed the door, and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Then she started the engine and drove. The car pulled away from the curb with a low, steady hum. The county office slipped out of view in the rearview mirror, shrinking into a flat, forgettable building like so many others. Elaine didn't look back for long. Just once. Then she let it go. Bruno sat upright in the passenger seat, his posture unchanged, eyes forward. The same quiet alertness he'd held outside the office. His ears twitched once as a truck passed in the opposite lane, then settled again. They drove through the edge of town without speaking. A gas station with 2 pumps, a closed diner with a faded sign in the window, a hardware store with its lights still off. Morning hadn't fully arrived yet, or maybe it had, and the place just didn't notice. Elaine kept both hands on the wheel. The road opened up ahead, stretching toward the low hills that framed the valley. Snow still clung to the higher ridges, thin and uneven, like something that had tried to stay and failed. She followed the curve without thinking. It felt familiar. Driving had become that way over the past few months. Not a choice, just motion, something to fill the hours between stopping. Her eyes drifted to the dashboard for a second, then back to the road. A small scratch ran across the plastic just above the radio. It had been there for years. Her husband had made it by accident, trying to pry something loose with a screwdriver. He'd laughed when it happened, said it gave the car character. She didn't think about that often. Not anymore. But sometimes, things like that stayed. The road dipped slightly, then climbed again. Trees began to close in along the shoulders, tall, narrow pines, their trunks dark from damp air. Bruno shifted beside her. Not restless, just adjusting his weight. His nose lifted slightly, catching something through the crack in the window. Cold air slid into the car, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and sap. Elaine rolled the window down another inch. For a while, though, there was only the sound of the engine and the tires against the road. Then, without warning, memory pressed in. 6 months earlier. The house had been quiet in a different way. Not empty. Not yet. Just still. Elaine stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the back of a chair, listening to the soft beeping of a machine in the next room. The kind of sound that settles into the walls if it goes on long enough. Her husband lay in the living room, propped slightly on pillows, a blanket pulled up to his chest. His breathing was shallow, careful. There had been no long lead-up, no years of decline, just a stroke. Sudden, clean, final in a way that didn't feel real at first. The doctors had spoken in calm, practiced tones, used words that sounded precise but meant very little once you left the room. Limited options. Best to keep him comfortable. Short window. Elaine had nodded when they spoke. She had always been good at that. Nodding. Listening. Doing what needed to be done next. The bills started arriving before she fully understood what had happened. White envelopes at first. Then thicker ones, statements, notices, adjustments. Numbers she had never seen attached to their name before. She sat at the same kitchen table night after night, opening them one by one, smoothing each page flat the way she had with the money at the county office, trying to make sense of something that didn't follow any kind of order. Bruno had stayed close during those weeks, closer than usual. He lay near the doorway most nights, head down but eyes open, watching the space between the kitchen and the living room, as if he understood there was something there he couldn't fix. After the funeral, the house changed, not physically, but in the way sound moved through it. Rooms felt larger, empty spaces held longer. Elaine moved through it slowly, touching things without purpose. A chair back, a countertop, the edge of a door frame, just to feel something solid. That was when her niece, Karen, arrived. She came with a suitcase and a careful smile. Not unkind. Not warm either. Practical. "I thought you might need help sorting things out," she said, setting her bag down in the hallway. Elaine had nodded. It seemed reasonable at the time. There were papers, accounts, things that needed to be handled, Karen worked in real estate, or something close enough to it that she understood forms and deadlines. She moved through the house differently. Purposeful. Efficient. Papers were gathered into stacks. Calls were made. Conversations happened behind closed doors that Elaine wasn't always part of. "It's just temporary," Karen had said one afternoon, standing by the kitchen sink. "We need to stabilize things, get ahead of the bills before they pile up further." Elaine had stood across from her, hands resting lightly on the counter. "What does that mean?" Karen didn't hesitate. "It means restructuring assets. The house is the largest one. We can sell it, clear the debt, and then figure out something more manageable for you." The words were clean, logical. They made sense when you listened to them one at a time. Elaine had nodded again. It seemed like the only direction things were moving. The timeline came later. A few weeks, then a date. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a steady narrowing of options until there was only one left. On the final day, Elaine packed what she could fit into the car. Clothes, a few books, a small box of photographs she didn't open. Bruno stayed close, moving from room to room with her, watching. At the front door, she paused. Not long, just enough to look once more at the space she had lived in for years. Then she stepped outside. Karen stood behind her, keys in hand. "I'll take care of everything from here," she said. Elaine nodded and walked away. Back in the present, the road curved again, pulling Elaine out of the memory. She blinked once, adjusting to the light. Bruno turned his head slightly, looking at her now instead of the road. His gaze was steady, searching, the way it had been that morning outside the county office. Elaine rested one hand briefly against his shoulder. "I know," she said softly. He held her gaze for a second longer, then turned back forward. The car continued on, moving deeper into the stretch of road that led away from everything familiar. The town was gone now. No signs, no buildings, just the road. And whatever waited at the end of it. Elaine drove until the fuel gauge dipped lower than she liked. She pulled into a small gas station just off the highway, a place that looked like it hadn't changed in 20 years. 2 pumps, a flickering sign, gravel crunching under the tires as she eased the car to a stop. The engine idled for a moment before she shut it off. Silence settled in. Bruno didn't move right away. He watched the empty lot, then glanced at her as if waiting for confirmation. Elaine nodded slightly. "Go on." He stepped out first, landing lightly, then circling once before standing still beside the car. His nose lifted, testing the air. There wasn't much to it. Old gasoline, dry dirt, the faint scent of something fried drifting from inside. Elaine filled the tank slowly. She counted again. Not out loud this time. Just in her head. What was left? What had already gone? What she needed to hold on to for as long as she could. When she finished, she went inside and bought a cup of coffee that tasted thin and a day-old sandwich wrapped in plastic. Bruno waited outside, exactly where she left him. He didn't wander, didn't bark, just watched. Back in the car, she unfolded the sandwich halfway, then stopped. Her appetite had become something unreliable. She set it down between them. Bruno looked at it, then back at her. "Later," she said. He rested his head on his paws. They drove again. By the time the sun dipped lower, the road narrowed. Fewer signs, fewer turns. The kind of driving where you don't pass anyone for miles and begin to notice the absence more than anything else. Elaine pulled off just outside a small town, if it could still be called that. A cluster of buildings, a closed storefront, a library with a single light on inside. She parked along the curb. "This'll do," she said quietly. Bruno lifted his head. The library smelled like paper and old carpet. A soft warmth hung in the air, different from the cold outside. The kind of place where time moved slower, even if nothing else did. Elaine signed in at the front desk. The woman behind it barely looked up, just nodded toward the row of computers along the far wall. Elaine sat down. The chair creaked slightly under her weight. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow across her hands. She hesitated for a moment, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Then she began to search. Affordable housing, short-term rentals, seasonal work, anything. Pages loaded slowly. Listings appeared and disappeared just as quickly. Numbers that didn't fit, requirements she couldn't meet, locations that were too far, too expensive, too temporary. She leaned back slightly. Exhaled. Bruno had followed her in and settled near her feet, his body angled toward the room, eyes moving quietly from one person to another. There weren't many. A man reading a newspaper, a teenager tapping at a phone. Still, Bruno watched. Always watched. Elaine turned back to the screen. She didn't know what she was looking for anymore, just something that didn't close the door before she reached it. She clicked another link, a government surplus page, mostly equipment, old vehicles, office furniture. Then a section she hadn't noticed before. Unclaimed or reassigned properties. She clicked. The page refreshed. A list appeared. Short. Scattered. Most of it didn't make sense. Parcels tied up in disputes, structures marked unsafe, landlocked properties no one wanted to deal with. Then she saw it. Ranger Station, Bitterroot National Forest, in holding. Price, $10. Elaine leaned closer. The photo loaded slowly, line by line. A clearing surrounded by dense trees. A structure barely visible at first glance. Dark wood, sagging roof, something leaning at one side. No road, no vehicles, no signs of recent activity. She clicked the next image. Closer. The cabin stood crooked, one corner dipping lower than the rest. The door hung slightly off-center. Windows clouded with age. She scrolled. Description. Access limited. No maintained road. Seasonal approach required. Structure condition unverified. Sold as is. She read it twice. Then again. Her hand moved without thinking, reaching for a scrap of paper on the desk beside the keyboard. She wrote down the location, coordinates, a nearby landmark, anything she could follow later. Under her breath, she read the place name out loud. Bitterroot, National Forest. The words sounded strange in the quiet room. Bruno's head lifted. Not sharply, just enough. His ears turned toward her. Elaine paused, looked down at him. He was already watching her. There was no reason for it. No signal, no command. Just attention. "Don't start that," she murmured, almost to herself. She turned back to the screen, zoomed in on the map. The property sat deep within the forest boundary, surrounded on all sides, no clear access line marked, just terrain, elevation lines curling over each other like waves. Most people would have closed the page, moved on. Elaine didn't. She sat there a long time, not searching anymore, just looking. Something about it felt settled, not promising, not hopeful, just there, unclaimed, untouched, like it had been waiting without expecting anyone to come. She folded the paper once, then again, slipped it into her coat pocket. When she stood, the chair gave a soft scrape against the floor. The librarian glanced up briefly, then returned to her work. Elaine stepped outside. The air had cooled. Evening settling in quietly, the sky turning a muted gray-blue. Bruno moved beside her immediately. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking down the empty street. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out the folded paper, and looked at it again. $10, she said softly. The number didn't sound real, but it didn't need to. Not anymore. She folded it back up and slid it away. That'll do. Bruno shifted his weight, stepping closer to her side. They walked back to the car together. No rush. No plan beyond the next turn. But for the first time in a while, there was a direction. Elaine didn't drive through the night. She found a quiet turnout just off the road, gravel pressed flat by years of tires that had stopped there for the same reason, rest or hesitation. She shut off the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel, watching the last of the light fade behind the trees. Bruno shifted beside her. Not restless, just aware. She reached for the sandwich she had bought earlier, unwrapped it slowly, and broke it in half. She handed one piece to him. He took it gently, chewing without hurry, eyes still moving toward the dark edges of the clearing. Elaine ate the other half in small bites. It wasn't about hunger. It was about not wasting what little she had. The night settled in. Cold, but not harsh, she leaned the seat back, pulled her coat tighter, and closed her eyes. Sleep came in short pieces, never deep, never long. The kind of sleep that listens even while it rests. At some point, Bruno lifted his head, a low sound in his throat. Not a bark, just a warning that something had passed nearby, something distant enough not to matter, but close enough to notice. Elaine didn't open her eyes. "All right," she murmured. The sound faded. Bruno settled again. Morning came pale and quiet. Elaine started the car, the engine turning over slower than she liked, then catching. She drove until the road changed, until asphalt gave way to gravel and gravel to packed dirt. The trees grew closer, taller, the kind that block out the sky if you don't look for it. She followed the directions she had written down, checking them twice at each turn, though there were fewer and fewer choices to make. The road narrowed until it felt more like a suggestion than a path. Finally, it ended. A rusted gate stood across what had once been a continuation of the road. A weathered sign hung crooked from one side. Its lettering faded enough that she had to step closer to read it. Seasonal closure. Below that, smaller print she could barely make out. Elaine stood there for a moment. Bruno stepped ahead, stopping just short of the gate. His body was still, ears forward, reading the space beyond it. No sound, no movement, just forest. Elaine walked back to the car. She opened the trunk and began to gather what she could carry. A worn backpack, a rolled blanket, a small bag of supplies, water, the rest of the food, a flashlight, a few things she hadn't yet decided she needed, but didn't want to leave behind. She worked slowly. Not because she was unsure, because she understood what it meant. There was no coming back for what she left here. Not easily. She closed the trunk and looked at the car one last time. The gray paint caught the morning light in dull patches. Dust settled along the edges of the windows. Inside, the seat still held the shape of where she had slept. She reached out and touched the door lightly. Then she turned away. Bruno moved ahead as she stepped around the gate. No hesitation, no command needed. The ground on the other side was uneven, packed with old tire ruts now softened by time and weather. Pine needles covered most of it, muting the sound of her boots as she walked. The air smelled different here. Cleaner. Colder. The kind of air that doesn't carry much with it. No traffic, no distant voices, just the faint scent of damp wood and earth. They walked in silence. Bruno stayed a few steps ahead, stopping now and then to look back, making sure she followed. His movements weren't rushed. They were measured, steady, like he understood the distance without needing to see it all at once. Elaine adjusted the weight of the pack on her shoulders. It pulled more than she expected. Not unbearable, but enough to remind her with every step that this was something she had chosen. The path curved gradually, climbing without urgency but without pause. Fallen branches crossed their way in places, forcing her to step over or around. Once her foot slipped slightly on loose gravel, and she caught herself against a tree, the bark rough beneath her palm. She exhaled slowly. "Still got it," she muttered, more habit than confidence. Bruno paused ahead, turned, waited. She nodded toward him. "Go on." He continued. Time stretched differently out there. Minutes didn't feel like minutes. They felt like distance. Step after step, the world narrowed to what was directly in front of her. The next foothold, the next bend in the path, the steady rhythm of her breathing. At one point, Bruno stopped completely. Not a pause. A stop. His body stiffened slightly, head turning toward the trees on the right. His ears angled forward, then back, then forward again. A low, almost silent growl slipped from his throat. Elaine froze where she stood. She didn't ask what it was, didn't call him back. She just waited. The forest held its breath. Nothing moved. No sound followed. After a few seconds, Bruno's posture eased. His head lowered slightly, and he took a step forward, then another. The moment passed. Elaine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "All right," she said quietly. She didn't ask again, didn't look into the trees. Some things out there didn't need to be named. They kept going. The climb became more noticeable now. The ground rose in uneven steps, forcing her to slow, to place each foot carefully. The pack pressed against her shoulders, her breathing deepening, steady but heavier. Bruno adjusted his pace. Slower now, matching hers. Not pulling ahead as much. By the time the light began to shift, afternoon edging toward evening, the trees thinned just enough to let more sky through. Elaine stepped over a fallen log and stopped. Ahead, the forest opened, not wide, but enough, a clearing. And at the far edge of it, something stood. Dark against the lighter ground, crooked still. Elaine didn't move for a second. She just looked. Bruno took a few steps forward, then paused, waiting again. The place was there, exactly where the paper had said it would be. And yet, it didn't feel like something she had found. It felt like something she had walked into. Elaine stood at the edge of the clearing, the weight of the pack pressing into her shoulders, her breath still settling from the climb. The air here was different, quieter, not just the absence of sound, but the kind of quiet that seemed to hold on to itself. The cabin sat slightly off-center, leaning just enough to notice if you looked long enough. One corner dipped lower than the others, as if the ground beneath it had given way years ago and never quite returned. The roof sagged in the middle, its shingles darkened with age and weather. Moss had begun to claim parts of it, spreading slowly, patiently. No path led up to the door. No footprints marked the ground. Just grass and scattered pine needles, undisturbed. Bruno stepped forward first. He didn't rush, didn't circle wide like he might in a new place. He walked straight toward the structure, his head low, nose working slowly, not sniffing everything, not searching for food or scent trails. Something else. Elaine followed behind him. Each step felt heavier now, not from the climb, but from the stillness that settled into the space. The kind of feeling that made you aware of your own movement, the sound of your boots against the ground louder than it should have been. A breeze moved through the clearing. Soft. It brushed the tops of the trees, barely touching the ground. The cabin didn't react. It just stood there, holding its shape against time. Elaine reached the front of it and stopped. The door was closed, but not tightly. One side sat slightly higher than the other, the frame warped just enough to leave a thin shadow along the edge. The wood was faded, gray where the sun had hit it most, darker where it hadn't. She set her pack down slowly. Her shoulders lifted as the weight came off, then settled again. She rolled them once, feeling the ache spread, then fade. Bruno moved along the front wall. Not in wide loops, close. Measured. His nose traced along the base of the cabin, then lifted toward the window. The glass was clouded, opaque with age and dust. Whatever had once been inside wasn't visible from here. Elaine stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under her weight, sharp at first, then softer as they adjusted. She paused, testing the next step before placing her foot down. Solid enough. She reached for the handle. It was colder than she expected. Metal that had held on to the night. She turned it. Nothing. Locked. She didn't pull harder. Just let her hand rest there for a moment. Then she leaned slightly, pressing her shoulder against the door. The wood resisted at first, then gave. Not with a clean motion, but with a slow, uneven shift. The latch held for a second longer than it should have, then cracked loose with a dull, splintering sound. The door opened inward. The air inside was still, not stale in the way of closed spaces in town. Different. Colder. As if it had been untouched long enough to forget what movement felt like. Elaine didn't step in right away. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. Light from behind her stretched across the floor in a narrow beam, catching dust in the air. It moved slowly, drifting, not disturbed by anything else. Bruno stepped past her. No hesitation. His paws made almost no sound on the wooden floor. He stopped just inside, then moved forward again, slow and deliberate. The room opened up around them. One large space, rough wood walls, darkened with time. The seams between the logs filled unevenly, some intact, others cracked and worn. The floorboards ran lengthwise, their surface dull but solid. A table stood near the center. Heavy, simple. One chair pushed halfway under it, the other angled slightly away, as if someone had stood up and never returned. Against the far wall, a stove, cast iron. Rust creeping along the edges, but the shape still strong. The stovepipe ran upward, disappearing into the ceiling, where it bent slightly before exiting. Maps hung on one wall. Faded. Edges curled inward. Some pinned in place, others sagging where the nails had loosened. Lines and markings barely visible now, like something remembered rather than seen. Elaine stepped inside. The floor creaked again, softer this time. She closed the door behind her without thinking. The sound echoed more than it should have, then settled. Bruno had already moved to the back of the room. He wasn't pacing, wasn't checking corners or sniffing for food. He moved along the wall slowly, his nose close to the surface, then paused. Lowered his head, lifted it again. He took another step, then stopped. Completely still. Elaine watched him. Didn't speak. Didn't call him back. There was something in the way he held himself. Focused, not curious. Intent. She let her gaze follow the line of the wall. Nothing stood out. Just wood, age, a few cracks where the structure had shifted over time. "Bruno," she said quietly. He didn't respond, didn't turn. He just stayed there, his attention fixed on a section of the wall near the far corner where the light from the window barely reached. Elaine took a few steps closer. Her boots made a dull sound against the floor. Bruno's ears flicked once at the sound, but his body didn't move. She stopped a few feet behind him, looked at the same spot. Still nothing. Just another piece of wall. She waited. A few seconds. Then she exhaled softly. "New place," she said, more to herself than to him. "Everything smells different." Bruno's posture eased slightly. Not fully, but enough. He stepped away from the wall, moving past her without looking back, heading toward the center of the room. Elaine turned slowly, taking in the rest of the space again. The table, the stove, the maps. Everything left as it had been. Not cleared out, not taken apart. Just left. She walked to the table and ran her fingers across its surface. Dust came away in a thin layer, leaving a faint trail where her hand had been. No recent marks, no signs of anyone else. Just time. Bruno circled once near the doorway, then settled down on the floor, his body angled toward the room, eyes open. Watching. Always watching. Elaine looked at him, then back at the room. "This is it," she said quietly. The words didn't carry much weight. Not yet. They just existed. She walked back to the door and opened it slightly, letting a thin line of outside light stretch across the floor again. Evening had begun to settle. The clearing outside dimmed, colors softening, edges blurring. She stood there for a moment, halfway between inside and out. Then she stepped back into the room and closed the door. The sound settled quickly. Wood against wood, a dull click where the latch no longer quite held the way it should. Elaine stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust again to the dimmer light. The thin line from the door had disappeared, leaving only what filtered through the windows, faint, uneven, stretched across the floor in soft gray shapes. The air inside felt colder now, not sharply cold, just steady. She moved slowly, setting her pack down near the wall where the floor felt the most even. The fabric brushed against the boards with a soft scrape, stirring a thin swirl of dust that caught the last of the light. Bruno didn't move from where he lay. His head followed her, though. Watching. Always watching. Elaine unrolled the blanket she had carried in. It was thinner than she would have liked, but it was what she had. She spread it out on the floor near the center of the room, avoiding the darker patches where the boards dipped slightly. She sat down carefully. Her knees bent slower than they used to. Her hands pressed against the floor to steady herself. The wood was cool beneath her palms. Solid. That mattered. For a while, she didn't do anything else. Just sat there, listening. The cabin made its own sounds, small ones. Wood shifting. A faint creak somewhere above, maybe in the rafters. The kind of noises that come from something that hasn't been still for too long, but hasn't been alive either. Outside, the wind picked up, not strong, just enough to move through the trees. It came in low at first, then rose slightly, brushing along the walls, slipping through the smallest openings where the structure had loosened over time. Elaine leaned back, stretching her legs out in front of her. Her boots stayed on. She wasn't ready to take them off. Not yet. Bruno shifted. He stood, slow and deliberate, then walked across the room toward the far wall again. The same path as before. His paws made almost no sound. He stopped near the stone hearth. It stood along the side wall, built from uneven stones fitted together years ago, darkened with age, some edges chipped, others worn smooth. Bruno stood there, still. His head tilted slightly, then straightened. He didn't bark, didn't scratch. He just stared. Elaine watched him from where she sat. "You see something?" she asked quietly. Her voice sounded different in the room. Lower, absorbed by the space instead of carried through it. Bruno didn't respond. His ears moved once, then again. He took a step closer to the hearth, lowered his head, lifted it again. Then he stood there, unmoving. Elaine let out a slow breath. "New place," she said again, the same words as before. "You'll get used to it." She shifted onto her side, pulling the blanket closer around her legs. Her body ached now, not sharply, just a steady weight from the climb. Her shoulders, her knees, the small of her back. All of it reminding her that she had done more in a day than she had in a long time. Bruno remained where he was for a while longer. Then, slowly, he turned away. He walked back toward her. Not quickly, not reluctantly. Just finished. He circled once near her blanket, then lowered himself onto the floor beside her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth from his body, but not pressed against her. Still alert. His head stayed up. His eyes open. Elaine closed hers. Sleep didn't come right away. It moved around her first. Light and uncertain. Her mind held on to small things. The sound of the door closing, the way the table had been left, the feeling of the pen in her hand that morning. They came and went without order. Then slowly, they began to fade. Time passed. She didn't know how much. At some point, the temperature dropped, the kind of cold that settles in layers. It crept through the floor first, then into the air, touching her hands, her face. Elaine pulled the blanket tighter. Her breath slowed. Bruno's ears twitched. He shifted slightly, his body angling away from her as stood enough to face the room again. Then, he lifted his head. Not all at once, gradually, as if something had changed, but not enough to alarm. His eyes moved toward the hearth. He stayed still, listening. There was no sound Elaine could hear, no movement she could see, just the quiet of the cabin holding itself together in the dark. Bruno stood, carefully. His paws placed one at a time. He moved back across the room. Same path, same place. He stopped in front of the hearth again. This time he didn't tilt his head. He didn't shift. He just stood there, staring. Elaine's eyes opened halfway. Not fully awake. Just enough. She saw him, a dark shape against the wall, still, focused. "What is it?" she murmured. Her voice didn't carry far. Bruno didn't turn, didn't respond. He remained exactly where he was. Elaine watched him for a few seconds, her mind too heavy to follow the thought, too tired to push it further. "It's nothing," she said quietly, more to settle herself than anything else. She closed her eyes again. The cabin creaked once, somewhere above, then went still. Bruno stayed where he was, standing, watching the same spot, for a long time. By morning, the cold had settled deep into the floor. Elaine woke slowly, not all at once. Her eyes opened before her body followed, her breath visible in the faint gray light that filtered through the windows. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell came back. Old wood, dust, stone. And it all settled into place again. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her joints protested a little, stiffness settling in from the night. Bruno wasn't beside her. That was the first thing she noticed. She turned her head. He was across the room, in the same place, standing in front of the hearth, exactly where he had been. Elaine stayed still, watching him. "Did you even sleep?" she asked, her voice quiet but clearer than it had been the night before. Bruno didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her. He remained focused on that same section of stone. The light shifted slowly across the room, revealing more of the space. Dust settled again, where it had been disturbed the night before. The table stood unchanged. The stove, silent. Nothing looked different, except him. Elaine sat up fully now, drawing her knees in slightly as she rubbed her hands together for warmth. "All right," she said under her breath. She stood, slower than she wanted, and walked toward him. Each step carried the same soft creak of the floor beneath her weight. The sound felt sharper in the morning quiet. Bruno's ears flicked once as she approached, but he didn't move. She stopped beside him, looked at the hearth. Stone fitted together in uneven layers, some pieces larger, some smaller. The mortar between them had cracked in places, worn down over time. Nothing obvious, nothing that stood out at first glance. Elaine leaned slightly closer, ran her fingers lightly along the surface. Cold, rough. She pressed against one of the stones. It didn't move. She tried another. Still nothing. "See?" she murmured, more to him than to herself. "Just old stone." Bruno shifted his weight. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and pressed his nose toward a specific point near the lower edge, closer to the floor. Not scratching, not pawing, just pressing, holding it there. Elaine followed the motion. Kneeling down beside him, she brought her hand to the same place. Her fingers traced the edge of the stone he was focused on. It felt the same at first. Rough, cold. But then a slight difference. Not in the surface. In the edge. She pressed again. Harder this time. The stone didn't move, but it didn't feel as solid as the others. Elaine pulled her hand back, sat there for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "All right," she said quietly. "Maybe not just old stone." She pushed herself back to her feet. The morning had begun properly now, light filling more of the room. The cold remained, but it felt less sharp with movement. She moved through the cabin slowly, focusing on small tasks, shaking out the blanket, adjusting her pack, opening the door for a moment to let in fresh air. Bruno followed her when she moved away from the hearth. But not far. He stayed within a few steps, watching her, waiting. Every now and then, he would glance back toward the same spot, as if checking that it was still there. Elaine noticed, didn't comment. Instead, she stepped outside briefly, breathing in the morning air. The clearing looked different in daylight. Less shadow, more shape. The trees stood taller, their branches catching the light in thin strips. She looked back at the cabin. From the outside, it didn't suggest anything hidden. Just age. Wear time. She stepped back in, closed the door again. Bruno was already moving. Back to the hearth. Same place, same posture. Elaine watched him for a long second. Then she walked over again. This time she didn't hesitate. She knelt down, placed both hands on the stone, pressed. Nothing. She shifted her grip. Pressed again, this time from the side. A faint movement, so slight she almost missed it. Elaine froze, looked at Bruno. His ears were forward now, alert, focused. She turned back to the stone, ran her fingers along the edge again, slower this time, feeling for the difference she had sensed before. There. A gap. Barely visible. But there. She hooked her fingers into the edge and pulled. The stone resisted at first, then shifted. Just enough. A dull scrape echoed softly through the room. Elaine paused, listened. Nothing changed. No sound beyond her own breathing. She pulled again. The stone moved a fraction more. Not loose, but not fixed either. Bruno stepped closer. His body leaned forward slightly, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence beside her. Easy, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She adjusted her grip, pulled again. The stone shifted another inch. Dust fell from the edge, drifting down to the floor in a fine line. Elaine sat back on her heels. Her hands rested on her knee now. She looked at the opening she had made. Still narrow, still unclear, but no longer solid. She exhaled slowly. A small sound, not quite relief, not quite concern, something in between. Bruno lowered his head again, bringing his nose closer to the gap. He didn't push, didn't scratch. He just held there, as if waiting for her to finish what he had started. Elaine reached forward once more, this time her hands steadier, more certain. She gripped the edge of the stone and pulled. This time it moved. Not easily, but enough. The stone shifted outward with a dry, scraping sound, dust breaking loose along the edges and falling in a thin line onto the floor. Elaine leaned her weight into it, steady and controlled, until the gap widened just enough to see behind it. Darkness at first, then shape. A narrow space carved into the wall, deeper than she expected. Elaine let go of the stone and sat back slightly, her breath coming slower now, more deliberate. Her hands rested on her knees, fingertips gray with dust. Bruno stepped closer. His nose moved toward the opening again, careful, controlled. He didn't push forward, didn't force anything, just held there, reading the air inside. Elaine leaned in. The smell was different. Faint. Old, but not decayed. Dry. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small flashlight she had packed. It flickered once when she turned it on, then steadied. The beam cut into the darkness. There was something inside. Wrapped. Set back just far enough that it hadn't been visible from the outside. Elaine hesitated for a second. Not out of fear. Out of something quieter. A kind of awareness that once she reached in, whatever this was, would no longer be unknown. She shifted forward. Slowly. Her hand entered the opening, brushing against rough stone, then something smoother. Fabric. She closed her fingers around it and pulled gently. It resisted at first, caught on the edge. She adjusted her grip, pulled again. The bundle slid forward. Wrapped in oilcloth, tightly bound, edges worn but intact. The material had darkened over time, but it hadn't broken down. It had held. Elaine set it on the floor in front of her. Bruno stepped back slightly, giving her space, but his eyes didn't leave it. She unwrapped the outer layer carefully. The cloth made a soft cracking sound as it unfolded, stiff from age but still protective. Beneath it, a metal box came into view. Rectangular. Simple. The kind used decades ago, solid, functional, no decoration. A thin line of rust traced along the edges, but the surface itself remained intact. Elaine ran her hand over the top. Cold. She turned it slightly. No lock. Just a latch. She paused again. Her hand rested on the metal, her fingers lightly curled against it. Bruno shifted beside her. Not impatient, just present. Elaine lifted the latch. It clicked open with a small, sharp sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. She opened the lid. Inside, paper. Carefully arranged, not scattered, not forgotten. Placed. On top, a stack of folded maps. Hand-drawn lines, markings in faded ink, edges worn from use but not damaged, each one folded with care, as if the person who made them had expected them to be opened again. Beneath the maps, a small bundle of bills. Old. Bound together with a thin strip of paper, yellowed with time. The edges of the bills were soft, the color slightly faded, but still clear enough to recognize. Not a large amount. But not nothing either. Elaine didn't count it. She didn't need to. It wasn't what held her attention. At the bottom of the box, a letter. Folded once, the paper thicker than the others. Her name wasn't on it. No name was. Just a date. Written in steady, careful handwriting. Early 1970s. Elaine lifted it slowly. The paper felt fragile, but not weak. Preserved. She unfolded it. The crease opened cleanly. The handwriting filled the page. Neat, measured, consistent. She began to read. Her eyes moved line by line. Bruno settled beside her, his body lowering to the floor, but his head remained up, angled toward her, watching. The cabin was quiet. The kind of quiet that holds steady, even when something shifts within it. Elaine read without speaking. Her expression didn't change much, not outwardly, but something in the way she held the paper did. More carefully, more anchored. The letter spoke of a man named Thomas Hale, a ranger, assigned to this station decades ago. He wrote about the land. Not in broad terms. In specifics, where the water ran strongest in late summer, which trails held snow longer than others, how the wind shifted in early winter, and where to stand to avoid it. It wasn't written like a story. It was written like a record. Something meant to be used. Toward the end, the tone shifted slightly, still calm, but different. He wrote about the station closing, about being told to leave, to move on. He didn't argue, didn't protest, but he didn't agree either. He wrote, "I was never under the impression this place belonged to me, but I was also never convinced it belonged to anyone else either." Elaine paused there. Her eyes held on the line for a moment longer than the others. Then she continued. He explained the box, the maps, the money, not as something to claim, not as inheritance, but as something left behind. "For whoever finds their way here," the letter said, "not by accident. No one comes this far by accident." Elaine read that line twice, then once more. Bruno shifted slightly, his body relaxing further now, his head lowering just a fraction. The letter continued with small details. Where to find a spring nearby. Which part of the cabin needed attention first. What to watch for when the seasons changed. Practical things. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just knowledge. At the end, there was no signature in the way she expected, just a name. Thomas Hale. Written the same way as the rest. Steady. Final. Elaine folded the letter carefully. Not the way it had been, but close. She placed it back in the box. Sat there for a moment. Her hands resting lightly on the edges, the maps beneath, the small bundle of cash. All of it quiet again. Unmoved, but no longer hidden. Bruno let out a slow breath. The first sign of ease since they had entered the cabin. Elaine looked at him. He met her gaze, then lowered his head fully to the floor. Resting. For the first time since they had arrived, she turned back to the open box. The light from the window caught the edges of the paper, the faint lines of the maps, the worn surface of the metal. Nothing about it was loud. Nothing demanded attention, but it held it anyway. Elaine closed the lid gently. The latch settled back into place with a soft click. She didn't move the stone back yet, didn't cover it. She just sat there, looking at the space where it had been hidden, and the space it had left behind. Elaine didn't reach for the stone right away. She let the opening remain as it was, exposed, uneven, no longer part of the wall in the same way. The cabin felt different now, though nothing had changed on the surface. The same table, the same stove, the same quiet. But something underneath had shifted. She sat there a while longer, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the metal box beside her on the floor. Bruno didn't move. He lay stretched out, his breathing slow and even, his body finally at rest. The tension he had carried since they arrived, gone. Not all at once, but enough to notice. Elaine picked up the letter again. Carefully. More slowly this time. She unfolded it along the same crease, smoothing the page with her palm before lifting it into the light. The handwriting looked steadier now than it had before, not because it had changed, because she had. She began reading again, from the top. This time she didn't move quickly through it. She let each line settle. Thomas Hale didn't write like someone trying to explain himself. He wrote like someone who had already accepted his decision long before putting it on paper. He described the land in quiet detail, not in a way meant to impress, in a way meant to be remembered. There's a spring north of the cabin, he had written, not marked on any map, You'll hear it before you see it. Runs steady, even in late August. Elaine glanced up for a moment, picturing it. Then continued. Wind comes down from the ridge after sunset. You'll feel it along the west side first. Don't trust the calm before it. Practical. Simple. Each line built from experience, not assumption. Further down, the writing shifted slightly, still steady but heavier. The station was closed without much discussion. One day it mattered, the next it didn't. Elaine's eyes paused there. She read it again. There was no bitterness in the words, no anger, just a statement. He went on to explain that he had been offered another position. Closer to town. Easier. He didn't take it. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he didn't believe the decision made sense. I don't think the usefulness of a place ends just because someone stops paying attention to it. Elaine let out a slow breath. She didn't realize she had been holding it. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. She continued. He described his time there in fragments. Seasons, storms. Long stretches of silence. The kind of living that doesn't need to be explained unless someone has done it before. Then, near the end, the part she had skimmed earlier. Now she read it more carefully. I left what I could carry with me. The rest, I chose not to. Elaine looked down at the metal box beside her. At the maps. At the small bundle of bills. Then back at the letter. This isn't something I'm giving away. It's something I'm leaving behind. The wording mattered. She could feel that now. It wasn't a gift. Not in the usual sense. It wasn't meant to be found by just anyone. It was meant to remain, until someone stayed long enough to notice. Her eyes moved to the final lines. If you're reading this, you didn't come here by mistake. She sat still. The words settled in the room without needing to be spoken aloud. Bruno shifted slightly beside her, his paws stretching forward, his body easing further into the floor. He let out a quiet breath, almost like a sigh. Elaine folded the letter again. Slower than before, more deliberate. She placed it back into the box, aligning it with the edges, the way it had been when she found it. Then she picked up one of the maps, unfolded it carefully. The paper was thin but strong, creased along familiar lines. The markings were hand-drawn, rivers, elevation, small notations in the margins that didn't match anything printed. Personal notes, short phrases. Loose ground here, good cover in winter. Watch for ice after first frost. Elaine traced one of the lines with her finger. It led away from the cabin. Deeper into the forest. Not toward anything marked. Just into it. She folded the map again, placed it back. Then she closed the lid of the box once more. The latch clicked softly. This time the sound felt different. Not an ending, just a pause. Elaine looked back at the opening in the hearth. The empty space. The shape of where the box had been. For years. Decades. Untouched. Waiting. She reached forward and slid the stone back into place. It didn't fit as cleanly as before. A thin line remained where the edge met the others, not enough to stand out from a distance, but enough that she would always know it was there. Bruno lifted his head briefly as the stone settled, then lowered it again, resting his chin on his paws. No tension now. No watching. Just still. Elaine sat back. Her eyes moved across the room, the table, the stove, the walls. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She didn't feel like she had uncovered something hidden. She felt like she had stepped into something that had been continuing long before she arrived, and would continue after. She rested her hands on her knees. The weight in her chest, different now. Not gone, but quieter. Less sharp. More grounded. She didn't look at the door. Didn't think about leaving. Not in that moment. She just sat there, in a place that no longer felt empty. The light shifted slowly across the floor as the day moved on. It reached the edge of the table first, then climbed the legs, then stretched across the boards toward the hearth. Dust drifted through it in small, quiet patterns, the kind you only notice when everything else is still. Elaine didn't rush to move. There was nothing pressing her. No clock on the wall, no voices calling from another room, no place she needed to be next. Just time. And the space around her. Bruno remained where he was. His body relaxed now in a way she hadn't seen in months. His breathing stayed even, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but aware. At some point, he stood. Not suddenly. Just rose, stretched his front legs forward, then stepped toward the door. Elaine watched him. "You going out?" she asked quietly. He paused, looking back at her, then at the door. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements slower but steadier than they had been the day before. She crossed the room, lifted the latch, and opened the door. Cool air slipped inside again. Bruno stepped out into the clearing. Elaine followed. The afternoon had settled into something softer. The light warmer now, leaning toward evening. The trees stood tall around the cabin, their shadows stretching longer across the ground. She stepped off the porch and stood beside him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Bruno lifted his nose to the air. Not searching, just taking it in. Then he began to walk. Not far, just a slow circle around the cabin. Elaine followed at a distance. She watched the way he moved now. No hesitation, no checking back every few steps. His path was calm, deliberate, like he already understood the boundaries of the place. He paused near the edge of the clearing, then turned back. Satisfied. Elaine stopped where she was. She looked at the cabin from this angle. Really looked. The lean in the structure, the worn edges of the roof, the way the door sat slightly off-center in its frame. Nothing about it was perfect. Nothing about it had been maintained. And yet, it stood. She stepped closer to the wall and placed her hand against the wood. It felt different than it had before. Not warmer, not softer, just known. Behind her, Bruno settled near the porch, lowering himself onto the ground where the dirt met the first board. His eyes followed her a moment, then drifted outward again, watching the tree line without tension. Elaine turned slowly. The clearing felt larger now, or maybe it just felt less closed. The air moved more freely. The silence didn't press the same way. She walked a few steps toward the far side, her boots brushing through the thin layer of pine needles that covered the ground. Each step left a faint impression, barely visible unless you looked for it. A mark. Temporary. But real. She stopped near the edge and looked out into the trees. There was no path. No sign of where one might begin. Just forest. Dense in some places, open in others. Unmapped, or maybe mapped, just not by anything she had seen before. Her hand moved instinctively to her coat pocket. The folded paper was still there. So was the letter. She didn't take them out. She didn't need to. Not right now. Behind her, Bruno let out a slow breath. The sound carried lightly in the open space. Elaine turned back. He was watching her again. Not the way he had before, alert, tense, waiting for something. Just watching. Present. She walked back toward him. Each step felt more certain than the last. She reached the porch and sat down on the edge, her legs stretched out in front of her. The wood creaked under her weight, but it held. Bruno shifted closer, not pressing against her, just near enough. The sun dipped lower. The light changed again. Shadows deepened along the edges of the clearing, while the center held on to the last of the warmth. Elaine rested her hands on her knees. Her gaze moved across the space. The cabin, the trees, the ground that hadn't seen footprints in years. She thought of the house she had left, of the rooms that had once held her life, of the silence that had followed her out of it. That silence had felt empty. This one didn't. This one held something, not something she could name, not something she needed to explain. Just something that stayed. Bruno lowered his head again, settling into the space beside her. The day slipped quietly into evening. No urgency, no expectation, just a steady shift from light to shadow. Elaine leaned back slightly, her shoulders resting against the frame of the door. She looked out at the clearing one more time, and for the first time since she had signed her name on that piece of paper, she didn't feel like she was between places. She wasn't passing through. She wasn't waiting for something else to happen. She was here, and it was enough. Some things are taken without warning. A home, a name on a mailbox, the sound of someone moving in the next room. And when they're gone, it feels like everything else goes with them. But sometimes, what remains isn't what you expect. It isn't the things you carried, or the places you planned to return to. It's what you find when there's nothing left to lose. A place no one claimed, a door no one opened, a quiet that doesn't ask anything from you, and the choice to stay anyway. Elaine sat there as the last light slipped behind the trees. Bruno beside her, the cabin behind her, the forest ahead. Nothing certain, nothing promised, just what was there, and what would come next. Elaine didn't move when the light finally slipped away. The clearing dimmed, the trees turning into outlines, the cabin settling behind her like it had always been there. Bruno lifted his head once, slow, easy, then rested it again. He wasn't watching the wall anymore. He wasn't waiting for anything. He had already done what he needed to do. She thought about that. How he hadn't chased anything, hadn't barked, hadn't tried to make sense of it.
He just stayed long enough to not take what didn't belong and just take it. Elaine looked down at her hands, still faintly marked with dust from the storm. Hours ago, she might have walked past it, might have told herself it was nothing, might have left, the way other people had, the way she almost had, in other parts of her life. She leaned back against the door frame and closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet, not empty, not heavy, just steady. Somewhere between losing everything and finding this place, something in her had gone quiet too, not gone, just waiting, the way that space in the wall had been waiting, the way the cabin had been waiting, the way he had stood there until she saw it. She opened her eyes again, looking out into the dark trees, and for the first time, she didn't wonder what she was supposed to do next. She just stayed and let it be enough. Have you ever almost walked past something that was meant for you just because no one else stopped to look?